Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Darst, Professor of Political Science, Director of Sustainability, and Director of the University Honors Program at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Professor Darst specializes in the transnational politics of environmental protection, human rights, and waste disposal. He is the author of Smokestack Diplomacy, Cooperation and Conflict in East-West Environmental Politics. He has also been published in numerous research journals, including Environment, Journal of Human Rights, and Global Environmental Politics. Currently, he is working on a project in collaboration with Professor Dawson of Connecticut College on the politics of meat in a comparative perspective. Professor Darst received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Today, he will provide us with an overview of globalization and inequality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Darst.
Good. Okay. Okay, so my assignment today is to set the stage for the afternoon's discussion of globalization and international environmental inequality by very briefly describing the broad structural causes of global environmental inequality and the most commonly discussed international policy responses. My goal is to paint a very big picture very quickly in very broad strokes. I cannot possibly do justice to all the differences among various parts of the world, various economic sectors, and various transnational actors. In other words, I'm about to commit an act of gross oversimplification. But whenever I find myself in this position, I think back to when I was an adjunct professor here about 12 years ago now, and a student was giving a presentation in class. Another student said indignantly, "You're oversimplifying," at which point he said, "But if you don't simplify, things get too complicated." And that's such a profound statement. It's struck with me ever since. So I am going to simplify. Otherwise, things will get too complicated, but I hope that the subsequent speakers will be able to reintroduce the complications that I am going to leave out. Okay, so for starters, what is globalization? Now, this is a very contested term. It has lots of meanings. It's like socialism, or liberalism, or feminism, or happiness. You have no idea what it means until you start to decode what the person who's using the term is trying to say. Okay? Far be it from me to say what the definition is. I would not dare do such a thing, but I will tell you the definition that I will use for the purposes of this presentation. It is the extension of commodity chains across national borders and very, very long distances. Now that begs the question of, what is a commodity chain? A commodity chain is all the processes that go into the production, distribution, transportation, consumption, and disposal of a particular product. And since all products are inputs into other products, and all products have other products that are inputs into them, transnational even any commodity chain is extremely complicated, and they're all interconnected. And they're becoming increasingly long geographically. For example, an iPod sold in New London, or an iPhone, consists probably of metals mined in Latin America, Africa, and Australia, components manufactured at various plants in China, Indonesia, Western Europe, and the United States, among other places. It was assembled at yet another facility, most likely in China. And after the latest and greatest model comes out 6 months from now, and it is discarded, it may well find its way to a poor part of India or China, where it will be recycled, which is the manual recovery of any useful materials and the quick and dirty discarding of whatever is left. And each stage in this process, the mining, the manufacturing, the transportation, the disposal, each stage has health and environmental risks that accompany it, all right? And most of those costs are paid by people in the geographical vicinity of the activity. Now, the globalization of commodity chains is not a new phenomenon. Depending on who you ask, you can go back to the 1500s or to the dawn of time, okay? But it has changed over time. And the hallmark of contemporary globalization, like the past 20, 30 years or so, is outsourcing, okay? This is the increasing separation of major retailers and brand name holders from actual ownership of the facilities that manufacture what they sell, all right? And this is made possible by the decomposition of commodities into many small separate parts, each of which can be subcontracted to external enterprises that operate at very, very low profit margins. This system of outsourcing allows large retailers and brand holders, so I've got in mind Apple, Walmart, Nike, Ford, et cetera, Home Depot, to reap most of the benefits from the final sale without the cost or legal complications of maintaining their own production facilities, which include the costs associated with worker health and environmental degradation and the danger of nationalization by foreign governments, which used to be something that Western corporations worried about a lot and now only worry about in a few industries, most notably extractive industries, and even there, less so than in the past. Why? Because they don't own the stuff anymore, okay? Now, economic globalization has always been accompanied by, I think I'm going to go forward now. Yes, here we go. Economic globalization has always been accompanied by the transfer of environmental and health risks. The main, yes, so as economic activities move from one place to another, many of the risks associated with them move too, because the risks are primarily felt in the immediate vicinity of the activities. The primary driver is the search for lower production costs, primarily labor costs. These differences in labor costs are the single most important factors here. There's differences in environmental regulation per se play a relatively small role in decisions to relocate from one place to another, all right? But since the effectiveness of environmental regulation is a function of income, okay, the higher the per capita income of a country, the more effective its environmental regulations as a general rule. That's a pretty straightforward one. Because of this relationship, low labor costs and lax or non-existent environmental regulations tend to go together, all right? So in other words, even if industries are not being driven by differences in environmental regulation as their uppermost consideration, that's what they get when they move in response to large differences in labor costs, okay? All right. Now, as a result, as activities like agriculture, mining, oil production, oil extraction, manufacturing, as they move from one place to another, many of the environmental and health consequences, although by no means all of them, move along with them. In fact, this is one of the reasons why more affluent countries have more advanced environmental policies, because they are exporting many of the environmental consequences of production. It's not that they're reducing them, they're sending them somewhere else, okay? And here's a graphic example. In this particular study, all of the various forms of environmental degradation have been reduced to a single common denominator, an amount of biologically productive land. This is the environmental footprint methodology, which I bet most of you have seen, even if you've not dug into the math behind the method. It's just a good way of taking lots and lots of different effects and trying to show them simultaneously. And what this shows is a net transfer of land use, which is in part real land use, but is mostly notional land use, like the land that would be required to clean up environmental degradation if you cleaned it up, okay, from one country to another as a result of international trade, all right? And it began with a paradox. This is a very recent study, it came out this year. It began with a paradox. If we look at countries individually, we see that consumption and land use, in this sense, rise with income, right? But among the most affluent countries of the world, the United States, Japan, Western Europe, Australia, so forth, the amount of land that would be required to support their rising consumption is much less than the actual increase in land use. So where is the missing land? It's in other countries, okay? Primarily what we call developing countries or the global south. And this shows the net transfer. Oh, whoops, wrong button. There's the one I want. Okay, so for example, the United States is a major agricultural producer as well as a manufacturer. Okay, so we actually are a net exporter of land to, we provide land use for Japan. All right, but we import land, if you want to think of it that way. We export land use to China, as does Europe, and Europe imports land use from Latin America and from Africa and from Southeast Asia and Russia. You know, you get the picture, okay? In other words, the direction of the arrow shows the provision of the missing land. And what's happening here is some of it is literal land use, and some of it, actually more of it, if you get into the methodology, is the contamination of natural resources, okay? That can be reduced into land use for the purposes of this methodology. Now, within the pollution importing countries or the land exporting countries, the consequences are quite dire, all right? The most deadly environmental problems in the world are water and air pollution that occur in the most heavily populated areas of the world's least affluent countries. And just give you a couple examples, and I could go on forever, but just make it quick. A World Bank study in 2007 found that 750,000 Chinese people die prematurely every year because of air pollution in large cities. That's almost certainly an undercount. The cancer rate in China is rising all out of proportion to life expectancy. It normally rises with life expectancy, but it's rising all out of proportion to that. And hundreds of areas have been effectively condemned as cancer villages, which has become the quasi-official term for these places. And the pattern is repeated elsewhere throughout the developing world. Climate change. which is now beginning to occur and will, by all accounts, continue to get worse over your lifetimes, is expected to disproportionately affect the poor regions of the world, partly as a result of their geographical position and partly as a result of having fewer resources to adapt, okay? They're not going to be building floating towns like the Dutch or constructing giant seawalls at someone else's expense like the Hamptons, okay? That's not happening in Bangladesh. All right, now, it's important to note that this export of pollution and risk is decidedly imperfect. A large amount of the exported risk comes back to the affluent countries through contaminated products, through contaminated people, and through contaminated transboundary commons. In 2007, many of you may remember this because you would have been still playing with toys at the time. In 2007, there was a tremendous scare about the use of lead paint in toys imported from China. Lead paint is cheaper to use than paint without lead because you can cover more surface with less paint. It's especially economic if there's a large supply of lead. In China, in the 90s and 2000s, the supply of cheap lead rose. And the main reason that it rose was because it could be easily recovered from electronic waste and scrap metal exported to China for recycling. All right? Contaminated people, I don't mean contaminated like with ideology or bad culture or something like that. I mean literally contaminated with illness. Okay? The greatest source of transboundary contamination via people is agriculture. That's where communicable diseases tend to come from. The agricultural production is not necessarily for export. It may be, but increases in unsafe agricultural production are driven by rising urbanization along the Chinese coast and other places like that. So, for example, there is a new bird virus scare in China. It's the H7N9. It will probably make the jump to people, at which point it will quickly jump across the oceans in aircraft. Okay, and the people, we don't know what ethnicity or nationality the people will be. The viruses don't care. Okay, so a tourist could walk through the bird market. Oh, look at the ducks, and come back to Boston with the virus. All right. Okay, and finally, and perhaps most importantly for the 21st century, contaminated commons, all right, contaminated shared environmental resources. Sulfur and mercury emissions from China now fall as far as the U.S. West Coast, in fact, further, but are imposing significant environmental degradation that far away. But the greatest of all will be the problem of climate change, which is caused by fossil fuel emissions wherever they occur in the world. And here's another recent study for you, if I get the right button. Here we go. This is the transfer of carbon emissions from those countries who agreed in the Kyoto Protocol to reduce their carbon emissions to those countries that made no such commitment. Okay? And this actually includes the former Soviet states that reduced their emissions because communism collapsed. And what you see here is that the production of carbon dioxide from a wide variety of sectors over, this is 1990, it's 2008, has increasingly moved. Now, this isn't because of climate policy, because even the Europeans don't really have a serious climate policy, okay? This is happening for economic reasons, because it's cheaper to move production and the emissions that go along with it to less affluent countries. But it does show what will happen when the United States and Western Europe finally get serious about doing something to address the problem of climate change. If they ratchet down their own emissions while still exporting production to other countries, this will simply grow. And the Earth doesn't care where the greenhouse gases are emitted. It won't make any difference. So this will be a major political issue in the 21st century. Okay, policy options. Told you this was going to be quick, all right? Quick and dirty. There are four main types of policy options that are commonly discussed. There are others, but I'm hitting the highlights here. The first is essentially do nothing. Okay? Continue to promote economic liberalization in the expectation that economic development will solve the problems it creates. Now, this may sound utterly crazy, but honestly, it isn't completely crazy. Okay? Economic development sets in motion a set of economic, technological, and political developments that in the long run, help to correct the initial damage. What's the argument? Integration into globalization, into the global economic system, especially in manufacturing, proceeds along a fairly predictable path. The first industries to arrive are those that require unskilled, very cheap labor. Textiles is typically one of the first ones to show up, okay? Manufacturing in New England, what did it start with? Textiles. Manufacturing in the American South, textiles. Manufacturing in China, textiles, right? It's typically the first thing to arrive. Over time, however, as labor costs rise, because you start running out of this pool of cheap laborers, it isn't an infinite resource. Over time, there's more competition for laborers, workers gain more skills, and the costs of living rise in the vicinity of the plants. And the manufacturers themselves start to look for ways to move up the technological value-added chain so they can make more money. All right? And so the really low-cost manufacturing moves again. And from the initial place where textiles used to be, you move up into the manufacturing of iPhone components or something. Okay? In the short run, this actually leads to worse environmental degradation because these higher tech industries are more energy intensive and they use new nasty chemicals and a wider range of nasty chemicals. And the short run can last for decades. This is coastal China now. Okay? But in the longer run, again, we're talking decades. In the longer run, this transition generates countervailing pressures that promote reduced environmental degradation, or at least slow it. Income levels rise, not for everyone, but for a significant minority, and those individuals become increasingly concerned about their own health and their children's health and the kind of air they breathe and so on. As pollution levels rise, so do the number of people harmed, and as the number of people harmed rise, that has political consequences. You see protests. There are environmental protests in China all the time now, okay, underreported because of censorship and just sort of general disinterest outside of China, but is a major source of political of dissatisfaction. Politicians, even in authoritarian states, have to pay attention. Okay, they have to do something. As overall income rises, so too do the resources available to do something about it. All right, it's one of the reasons why more affluent countries have more effective environmental policies. And this is an important one not to forget, that as you're trying to move up the chain of adding value to make your production, to produce things that earn more money, you require increasingly clean inputs, especially cleaner water. And if you're operating with polluted inputs, the need to treat them adds cost to your operations. So businesses start to, selectively complain about environmental degradation. All right? So the proponents of the do-nothing strategy, you point to history to demonstrate their point. Almost all of today's affluent, well-regulated countries, including the United States, including Germany, including the Netherlands, achieve this status only after passing through their own periods of socially and environmentally destructive development. And the accompanying wealth was used later, decades later, to remediate the destruction that was caused earlier. All right? So that's one approach. Another, and the others don't take as long to explain, is the international negotiation of minimum environmental and health standards across countries. This happens all the time. Continually unfolding process. World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, wide range of environmental treaties focusing on specific issues. Representatives of countries from all over the world are constantly at it. The limitation here, or one of the many limitations here, is that the positions that governments take are driven by their perceptions of their national self-interest. Affluent countries care mainly about problems that directly affect them, their citizens. Developing countries want foreign assistance in exchange for any policy change. And monitoring and enforcement are really problematic because of concerns about national sovereignty. And the easier it is to monitor compliance, the more resistance there is from those who benefit from the status quo. So what you tend to see emerge from international negotiations are relatively weak minimum standards with weak or non-existent mechanisms for monitoring and typically no mechanism at all for enforcement. Okay? It's not that they're useless, it's just that it's limited. All right. A third is to unilaterally restrict exports or imports of unilateral restrictions on imports or exports that are imposed by the more affluent countries. This doesn't happen all that often. One example would be the European Union's imposition of a ban on exports of toxic wastes from its territory. This was made possible by the fact that the German waste recycling industry was well developed and stood to benefit economically by processing the waste if it remained inside the European Union. It may also occur if the outsourced activity is perceived to be extraordinarily dangerous transnationally. So an example of that would be the Russian proposal to import all of the world's radioactive waste. That was fairly quickly nixed by opposition from the United States and Western Europe because of the fears of transnational radiation contamination and concerns about proliferation as a security risk. And then finally, sometimes it occurs if the heartstrings of the public are very deeply pulled. Like if a being is being hurt that is a particular public interest, like a dolphin, okay? If you hurt a dolphin, you're in trouble, okay? Don't mess with dolphins. The United States banned imports of tuna for years, caught with fishing gear that might harm dolphins. It was an international uproar. It went before the World Trade Organization. It was a huge conflict, okay? Unfortunately, people being harmed doesn't generate quite the same emotional response, okay? So if you want to find a way to restrict the activities of a multinational corporation, see if you can find them harming dolphins, okay? Because then you're liable to get a public outcry. Okay. Finally, this one is relatively new and increasingly gaining in popularity, is to pressure the brand holders to adopt voluntary codes of compliance. These are typically codified in certification or labeling schemes. You've seen them. International Standards Organization, ISO, Forest Stewardship Council, Fair Trade Certified, Rainforest Alliance, Fair Labor Association, there are lots of them. The stick is bad PR, okay? The carrot is good PR. What does Nike own? The swoosh. Okay? That's its primary asset, the brand name and the logo. Brand names and logos are like reputations, okay? You don't want to see them tarnished. You want to see them enhanced. So increasingly, activists work directly with corporations to come up with codes of sort of minimally acceptable conduct, environmental labor standards, a variety of other things, and then schemes for monitoring compliance with them. And remember that the violations are typically happening in facilities that are not owned by the brand holder, which complicates monitoring compliance, okay? But it has the advantage that this approach completely bypasses all the problems associated with intergovernmental negotiations. Okay, it's much faster, it's much more flexible, and in many cases is proven more successful. But again, monitoring enforcement is a problem, especially if industry is left to monitor its own compliance, in which case the fox is guarding the hen house, all right? So that was the problem early on. Increasingly, we see movement towards third-party monitoring schemes and things of that nature. All right, so that gives you, that's the big picture, okay? Environmental degradation moves from one country to another as economic activity moves from one country to another. It's not driven primarily by differences in environmental regulations, but it has the effect of moving from countries with better regulations to countries with poor regulations, and it makes better regulations easier, okay? The Germans and the Dutch and all the perfect Swedes and everybody that we look up to, they also consume things that were produced in places with lax environmental regulations, okay? They also export their pollution. Addressing it is not easy. All of the dominant approaches that are available are problematic. okay? But it's possible, all right? All these, in particular, the development of the voluntary codes of conduct, a lot of people have put a lot of effort into that, okay? In fact, my guess is some of you will find yourselves doing that because it's kind of an entry-level career position for people who major in environmental studies, all right? So I'm going to end it on that note, and all this stuff is going to come up again later in the afternoon and tomorrow. Thanks.